Whenever you hear the auto manufacturer Isuzu mentioned, the first type of vehicles that would probably come to mind would be commercial vehicles, mainstream vehicles like the Rodeo, or other vehicles that were based on GM platforms such as the Ascender SUV and the I-Series pickup. That said, a turbocharged sports car typically does not come to mind. Well, that's exactly what the Isuzu Impulse was. A performance car that was incorporated into the US market via General Motors. In this episode, we're going to discuss how the Isuzu Impulse came to fruition and how it ultimately met an untimely demise. So pour up a cup of tea, kick back, and let's get down to the nitty-gritty. It all began in the late 1970s, when Isuzu discovered there was a small window of opportunity for affordable performance vehicles within the market at the time. So they decided to go for it despite the risk. After all, attempting to design and engineer a quick car with new technology while keeping costs low as possible presents a huge challenge for auto manufacturers. However, they decided to move forward with the project. Isuzu and General Motors had teamed up in the creation of other vehicles, so this was just one of their many collaborations. Designated as chassis code JR120, 130, the car that would soon become the first generation Impulse was going to be designed in Italy, built in Japan, backed by a huge American auto manufacturer, and tuned by the British, making it indeed a world product. Giorgetto Guigiaro, an influential Italian designer that worked on supercars, as well as typical everyday cars, is one of the most prominent industrial designers in history. With a decades-long career, he's had his hand in well over 100 cars, including the Volkswagen Golf, the Isuzu Grifo, and the DeLorean DMC-12. Guigiaro was called upon by Isuzu to draft up a replacement for the aging 117 Coupe, which was a Grand Touring fastback coupe produced between 1968 and 1981. Guigiaro was also responsible for the design of that car as well. Basically, Guigiaro was given free rein coming up with the new design. Isuzu's only requirement was that the end product used GM's existing T-Car platform, which was the same platform that was utilized by the Chevette. In 1979, Guigiaro's striking concept, the Ace of Clubs, debuted at the Geneva Auto Show. The car was a showstopper and sported a wedge-shaped design, just like the Lotus ESPRIT, which he also created. The car definitely had influence on global car designs. At the time, features such as flush glass, hidden seams, and doors that blend into the roof were simply non-existent and never thought of when this concept debuted. These features established by the Ace of Clubs concept ended up becoming the norm on the majority of cars by the early 90s. And as we are all aware, concept cars are just a way of teasing a dramatic design. A lot of times, very little would carry over from that initial dramatic concept to the actual production model. However, that was not the case with this concept, since the planned production model would differ very little from Guigiaro's show car. And as soon as the following year, 1980, the stunning design was put into Japanese production. In the Japanese market, this car went with a completely different name. However, once the car hit US shores, it was badged as the Impulse. It hit the market when cars such as the second generation Honda Prelude was on sale, which was often somewhat cross-shop, both being Japanese manufactured with a similar price tag and having sporting intentions, even despite the fact that one was front drive and the other was rear. The Impulse was tuned by Lotus, which at the time was owned by GM. The suspension was derived from Lotus, and the Impulse also benefited from stiffer dampers, softer springs, and a wider sway bar. More on that later. The Isuzu Impulse was a solid performer that reached 60 miles per hour within 8.5 seconds, which was actually above average of performance cars of this era. Along with this performance, it benefited from a sleek and sporty appearance, similar to the likes of the ZX. And being a 1980s sports car, of course it had pop-up headlights. Only these were a tad bit different, having a partially exposed eyebrow theme. But despite all this, the first generation Impulse sat upon a modified version of the T-body platform. which was GM's global platform that was also employed by cars such as the Chevette and the Pontiac 1000. Now, to make things clear, the Impulse first hit the US market for the 1983 model year, whereas the very first production model for the Japanese domestic market rolled off the assembly line in late 1980, which went on sale for the Japanese market for the 1981 model year. So, for the two initial model years, 1983 and 1984, the US market Impulse had a single engine option, which was a 2-liter single overhead cam inline 4 that cranked out 90 horsepower. As far as the transmission, you could get either a 5-speed manual or a 4-speed automatic. The 1985 model year gained a turbocharged engine, which was essentially the same 2-liter inline 4, now producing 140 horsepower. The new turbocharged engine came with tech such as Isuzu's iTech control system, which would pull in between 6.7 and 8.5 pounds, boosting the car without sacrificing fuel efficiency. The Impulse's turbocharging came with a new technology of air-to-air intercooler. So in a nutshell, the air coming from the turbo is cooled before it enters the engine. Thus, most of the heat produced by the turbocharging process is removed, and it, in turn, reduces the density and temperature of air, allowing more fuel to the combustion chamber, increasing power more than what the turbo produces. The RS trim came out in 1987, which sported a 4ZC1 turbo engine. For 1988, the Impulse got a mid-cycle refresh. Most notably, changes were made to the exterior. Gone were the half-exposed pop-up headlamps, and in were new quad fixed units. This was also the same year when the Impulse got a Lotus tuned suspension with the upgraded sway bars and stiffer dampers that we mentioned earlier.
Lotus dictated new springs and bushings, slightly stiffer gas shocks, and a larger front stabilizer bar.
The naturally aspirated 2-liter inline 4 was swapped out in favor of a larger displacement engine, which was a 2.3-liter inline 4, putting out 110 horsepower. However, this larger displacement was only offered for the US market because a larger displacement engine placed in a compact car went against Japanese regulations. The second generation car debuted in 1989 as the 1990 model year, ditching the T-body platform and adopting General Motors' second generation R-body global platform, which was shared with cars such as the Geo Storm. Rather than being outsourced, the second generation was an in-house design. This time around, Shiro Nakamura, Isuzu's chief designer at the time, oversaw the design aspect of the project. According to Nakamura, the design took inspiration from cars from the 1960s and 1970s, particularly with the front end of the car. It even had styling cues that differentiated it from the Geo Storm, a car it was closely related to. Nakamura later departed Isuzu to join Nissan as the chief designer. Overall, the styling was toned down. However, it did retain some of its styling cues from its predecessor, most notably the semi-concealed, half-exposed eyebrow headlights with integrated grille. The body design of the Impulse was heavily influenced by General Motors and drew heavily from GM Europe's design submission, which ultimately led to the Lotus Elan M100. The new Impulse chassis also spawned a 4-door sedan better known as the Stylus. The new Stylus was built on the Impulse platform and even carried over interior components from the Impulse. We'll discuss that in another video. Now, to eliminate any confusion, the first generation Impulse Coupe was rear-wheel drive, while the second generation switched to front-wheel drive, with optional all-wheel drive. 1990 saw the release of the Impulse XS. The 3-door hatchback offered only a front-wheel drive configuration, equipped with the dual overhead cam 1.6-liter inline 4, cranking out 130 horsepower and 102 foot-pounds of torque. The suspension comprises McPherson struts in the front and in the rear, with a rigid trailing arm front suspension and a multi-link rear suspension. The Impulse RS returned for 1991, and just like the 1987 model, the second generation also came with a turbocharged engine, this time putting out 160 horsepower. All-wheel drive was also available for this model, and in the same year, a wagon-back model hit the showroom floors. However, you could only get one of those with a naturally aspirated 1.6-liter inline-4. With the Impulse being a relatively light car, it being equipped with the turbocharged engine and all-wheel drive made it an exceptional performer. During the days of the Impulse and the Geo Storm, the WRX had yet to go on sale in the US. Just to name a few, other cars with all-wheel drive and turbo in this particular price range were the DSMs, such as the Talon TSI and the Eclipse GSX. The Plymouth Laser was the odd man out, since this RS Turbo all-wheel drive model didn't show up until the following year. Sure, the Dodge Stealth and the 3000 GT were on sale at the time and offered all-wheel drive, but they were twin turbo, not to mention way more expensive. The XT6 was on sale, but its turbocharged model was dropped a few years prior. And the 1991 Celica All-Track Turbo was a car everyone wanted back then, but they were a bit difficult to attain since less than 2,000 of them were built. And yes, the Ford Probe GT was on sale at the time, and although it was turbocharged, it was not available with all-wheel drive. 1992, the turbocharged engine was dropped from the lineup, and the base engine, which was the 1.6-liter, was swapped out in favor of a 1.8-liter engine, sharing the same bore but with a larger stroke. This was mainly because of the taller engine block. The bigger engine pushed the power output to 140 horsepower. The three-door hatchback, along with the wagon back, were both available for 1992, but in limited numbers. During this period of time, General Motors owned nearly half of Isuzu and also owned Lotus. The 1.6-liter engine and transmission from the Isuzu Gemini was adopted by Lotus for usage in the Lotus Elan N100, and ultimately a variant of that engine eventually ended up in the Impulse. Lotus was recruited by Isuzu to fine-tune the suspension of the Impulse. Just like the first generation, the new Impulse gained stiffer dampers, larger sway bars, and softer springs. Each and every second generation Impulse boasted a suspension tuned by Lotus. Okay, so this car also had a passive rear-wheel drive steering system, but that system was not developed by Lotus. The system adjusted the toe of the rear wheels by changing the rear wheel alignment through the range of suspension travel. Despite having good reviews, the Impulse, as well as the Storm, were destined to be discontinued for the 1993 model year. The executives at General Motors decided to put a stop to its manufacture and marketing campaign, and for this reason, sales of the Impulse came to an end in America. Another aspect for the end of its production run was simply declining sales. This second generation model was often cross-shopped with cars like the 1GA and the new for 1992 1GB Eclipse, which enthusiasts typically favored more. This was part of the reason the Impulse was dropped from the market altogether. Even with the brand new second generation design, the car never had a significant breakthrough in the US market. The second generation Impulse was on sale in the United States just for 3 model years, but the Impulse wasn't done just yet. The car was able to see one more extra model year in Canada, although going with a new name, SUNFIRE. Now this is where it gets a little tricky. In 1990 and 1991, a variation of the Impulse was sold in Canada. However, for the 1992 model year, was skipped completely. So in other words, there was no 1992 model sold in Canada, and this happened to be the final model year for the car in the US market. For the Canadian market, in 1993 the hatchback model returned for one last ride, equipped with the 1.8-liter engine as the Isuzu SUNFIRE. But this was also the ending of the Isuzu brand altogether. The nameplate went on to find itself on one of GM's J-platform cars, a Pontiac, which was a variation of the third generation Chevy Cavalier. And although these two cars share the same nameplate, they are not associated in any other way. With all that being said, no true successors arrived for the Impulse or the Storm. These cars are a rare sight, and I think I've only seen 2 of them within the past 20 years or so. And even as I recall back in the 90s, you really didn't see too many back then either. So the Isuzu Impulse goes down in history as a fine-tuned, hot hatchback that unfortunately missed a chance to captivate budget-conscious enthusiasts. But what do you guys think? Have you had the opportunity to drive one of these cars? Or perhaps you've seen one on the road recently? Let's hear your thoughts in the comments. This is your host Rob, and until next time, thanks for tuning in to Antique Tags.